We're talking today with Robert Hoffman of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Okay. I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1950, and my father was a World War II veteran. He was a dentist, and he served in the medical corps. He's actually in the Third Army. He told me he heard a few of Patton's speeches. My uncle served in an artillery unit. He was an artillery forward spotter, and he actually, I believe in the Battle of the Bulge, was able to save the lives of 90 men and some who were very poorly, injured quite severely. And he received the Silver Star for that. But later in the war, he was hit by friendly fire, lost a leg, and the leg that he kept had injury on it all his life. My father-in-law served with, actually was a bodyguard for General Bradley. And a little story he told me, which is kind of interesting. He said one day, I believe it was in England, there was going to be a very significant secret meeting, and General Bradley said to my father-in-law, Ray, said, we're going to shut the door, take your machine gun, and make sure nobody enters this room. He said, yes, sir. So up came a general officer and said, I need to go in that room. And my father-in-law said, no, sir. General Bradley said to nobody was going to come in. He said, Corporal, I'm going in that room. And he said, no, sir, no, you're not. He said, do you know who I am? Yes, sir, General Patton, I know who you are. I'm going in that room. And my father-in-law drew the bolt back on his .45 caliber, or I mean his automatic machine gun, pointed it at him. And at that moment, Bradley opened the door. Don't shoot him, Ray, don't shoot him. They said, come on in, George, he said. And as he's closing the door, he said, George, you know he would have shot you. And so then later my father-in-law said, General Bradley, what do I do now? He said, well, Ray, if I were you, I would keep out of General Patton's way. So he had a few more interesting stories, but that was one of the one that was most unusual. So I grew up in the 50s, and the 50s was a very patriotic time for America. I remember my grandfather would take I was the third of 11 children, would pick up my brothers and sisters and some of my cousins and take us to the local Memorial Day parade. And on the way, our job was to count every American flag on every house, which was in the hundreds at the time. Everybody would put up a flag at that time. And so it was just a wonderful time to grow up. In the early 60s, it was the centennial of the Civil War, and we just went to every Civil War battlefield. I studied and read every book I could find. But things began to change. President Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. There were the civil rights was coming to the forefront. There were the riots in 65, 67, 68. During that time, I remember very clearly early in the 60s, my father took the Grand Rapids Press and the Detroit Free Press. And I always like to wake up early and get the press and read about the Tigers, but I unfolded it, put it on the table, and it said, President Kennedy is sending 15,000 Marines to, I think it was Da Nang. I go, what is that? What is Vietnam? And then during the 60s, it escalated, and then there was news of Vietnam every night. And then during the late 60s, it was always this, well, another 250 soldiers died week after week after week. In 68, they had the Democratic National Convention, and the anti-war movement was growing, and we saw images of the protesters coming in and the police just attacking and beating them. It was horrible. It was, when I saw the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, I was reminded of that actual incident. In 1969, the government was under extreme pressure to change the draft system because it was basically unfair. If you were rich and could go to school or could get into the National Guard, you didn't have to go to Vietnam. So they decided to go to a pure lottery system, and every 19-year-old boy, I was 19 at the time, would have his birthday, would have a number, and then they would pick the numbers out of a hopper. And then I was watching it closely that night, and my number was 87, which was pretty low. And thinking I am going to get drafted. I had a 2S, which was a deferment for a student at the time, but I knew that eventually I would graduate and probably be drafted. It is interesting, I am now a professor at Creston University, and one of the courses I teach is statistics, and there was a statistical error in that lottery. That when they picked the numbers and they put them in little blue cartridges, if I remember correctly, and put them in a big vat, they did January 1, January 2, and all the way up to December 31, filled the box, and then did not stir it very much or mix it up and put it out, and then people reached in at random and pulled a number. So they found out later that the last 3 months, October and November and December, were chosen more often than probability would indicate, which I was born on October 6th. So it's now in the stats books that this is a way not to do the lottery correctly. Anyway,
Okay.
so 68, 69 was the lottery. In 1970, the Kent State incident occurred, where there was Kent State students that were protesting the war. They put the National Guard, young men, and somebody gave them real ammunition, and they fired and they killed students on our American students on an American campus. And you go, this is incredible. In 1971, one of the most impressive things for me at the time was that there was a march against the war. It was Vietnam veterans against the war. These were all people who had served honorably. They were wearing uniforms. They all had been, many of them were decorated. They had medals. And they walked up to the White House and said, we don't want these, we're throwing them back. And it was in my mind watching it, I'm going, oh my word, the war is bad. The war is not good.
Okay. I'd like to just back up a little bit here
Sure.
in the story for a few things. So first of all, Kennedy, to be fair, Kennedy didn't send 15,000 Marines to Da Nang. The large number going in was 65, so that was Johnson.
Okay, right.
But Kennedy was already sending a lot of advisors.
That's correct.
And air units were going over, and there was a lot of Americans already there. The big ground troops going in is 65. But anyway,
Correct.
But all of this stuff, yeah. But it's ramping up. Initially, my impression was that the news was reasonably positive or supportive of this until 68.
That's correct.
When things kind of flipped. Now, where did you go to high school?
I went to Creston High School. It doesn't exist anymore, but in North End, Grand Rapids.
So you were a public
Yes,
school
public
student,
school.
so you were not in the Christian schools at that point.
Right.
Now, your father was a veteran and so forth. When he's looking at Vietnam, how did he respond to all of that?
He actually told me, he said, Vietnam is a war where they should send only volunteers, regular troops. A draftee should not be sent there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if he was thinking of his own sons, because we were all going to be, he had 3 that were going to be of draftable age. Mm-hmm. My elder brother actually his eyesight was too poor. He was rejected. He went for a physical. And my elder brother, 1 year older, got a very high draft number. But he actually thought it was an unfair war. Mm-hmm. When I actually was going to be drafted and go in, and I was asking for advice, I believe he would have said, he actually said, well, you know, it's not a good war, and it's not, but you've been drafted, you've been called. Mm-hmm. He was going to be drafted back in World War II, so he enlisted, but he knew he would go, because every man in that era. But it was thought, this is a war which is really one that we need to fight, and there's tyranny here, and we have to overcome tyranny. Vietnam, you go, it was pretty hard to figure out, what are we going there for in the first place? Why are we fighting? And if you look back, I remember reading the Pentagon Papers, which was Daniel Ellsberg published, and you look at, say, what if there's no logic here? It says we need to pick a place to fight communism. Yeah. Here's a good place. Mm-hmm. They go, and you're sending men to die. It makes no sense. So my father probably would have said, no, it's not a good war, and knowing that you should not have sent draftees.
Okay. And then where did you go to college?
First of all, I went to what was called Grand Rapids Community College, and then I went to Western Michigan University.
Okay. And you were training to be a teacher at Western?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So as long as you were in school, so you have 4 years of a college deferment, basically. So when did you graduate from Western?
I graduated in '72,
okay,
which coincides with the last year of the draft, and I described that it looked like I wasn't going to be drafted. I was married, and so I was applying for teaching jobs all over the place. I actually had a couple offers, and I eventually, I thought, nah, my wife, we talked about it, I said, maybe not there, maybe not there. And it's very clear in my mind what happened was I was I actually went to talk to some recruiters. I went to the Navy and talked to them, and I walked to the Army. And an Army recruiter said, well, let's see, you're pretty draftable. I'll call your draft board for you right now. Calls them up and says, okay, thanks. You're getting your letter tomorrow.
Oh.
And so my wife is just crushed, and I'm crushed. This is on a Friday. I'm going to be drafted. On the next Monday and Tuesday, I received 10 phone calls from school systems, not calling me for an interview, but offering me a job. I'm going, no, sorry, no. I have a job, sorry. I'm going, what in the world is this? It was very ironic. So,
now, would having a job have made a difference at that point?
what would have happened was, at that time, if I had taken an offer and gotten a job, I would have still been drafted, but they would have been obligated to hold the job when I got out to come back.
Yeah.
So my trajectory of life would have been very different if I had taken a job. One was in Three Rivers, Michigan. It was middle school, 7th grade. I remember they showed me the room that I would have, and I would have had to have come back. So that's the only difference, but I still would have had to go.
Okay. So remember what time of year it was you got the draft notice?
That would have been August, early September of that year.
Okay. So that's 72.
Yep.
So by this time, at least the Americans were definitely in a full-scale drawdown out of
That's
Vietnam.
correct.
So were you aware that the risk of you're being sent there was getting lower?
Right, the probability was lower. So here's what happened. It wasn't absolutely clear, but when I was in boot camp, it wasn't, the information came through that was told, okay, no more draftees are being sent to Vietnam. And it was very soon after that, no regular people were going. And then early in 73 was when Kissinger made the initial agreements, and they signed the peace treaty in like September of 73. But it was pretty clear when I was in boot that I wasn't going to go to Vietnam.
Yeah, all right. So basically, what's the process for you? When you first have to report, where do you go?
Okay, well, you first go to have your physical. It is in Detroit, and you have your physical, and they say you're okay. And then my wife said, can you arrange so you can stay for your birthday and then go after that? So I went in and initially was instead of going right to the boot camp from Detroit, I got a month off, and I didn't realize I was being given seniority. I got an extra month of seniority because I was technically in the Army. A month later, I went back to Detroit and took the oath of office, or the oath you take as a soldier, and immediately I was put to work. It said, okay, you're now a private in the Army, you're going to do this over here for a while. And then we were sent to Fort Knox, and they, on purpose, if I understand this correctly, they leave Detroit in the evening, so you arrive at Fort Knox at 2 a.m. So you're in total disarray and shock, and people are saying really bad things to you, and you're not standing up straight, and you just want to be totally disorganized, and so that they can take you out of your comfort zone immediately, and then try again to actually do this to bring you up as a soldier this way.
All right. What kind of mix of people were you in basic training with?
There was a large group from Miami inner city Miami, which was mostly black young men from Miami, men from Detroit, inner city Detroit, and I was from Grand Rapids. There was a few other people from odd places, and other boys from the hills of Kentucky. Now, I want you to understand, you think about that mix a minute. And so there was some, let's say, differences of opinion. And, but basically, it was very clear they wanted to make you all one thing called a soldier, and a soldier who would obey commands. And, they cut your hair down to nothing and give you the same uniform. And so I was considered, I could speak in such a way. Actually, some of the soldiers said, you do teacher talk. What do you mean by teacher talk? Well, they meant my vocabulary was a degree on a higher level than everybody else's, but I didn't show any. I apparently was able to enjoy my mates. My bunkmate was a young black man from Detroit. We became very good friends. So it was a very significantly diverse group. Our drill sergeants were all, there was one white drill sergeant, but the rest were all either Hispanic or black men, and all vets, of course, all harsh, tough, and wanted to keep us alive.
Okay. Now, were you one of the oldest people in your group?
Yeah, I was probably, there was only a couple of college graduates by that time, you know, because the things were easing off. There were less college grads. There were actually multiple veterans that had, okay, they got out of the Army and said, well, I mean, I kind of liked it there, and I felt like that was a place where I knew what I was doing, and I go into society and I don't fit. I'm going to go back in. So there were men who were coming back who had already been served a time, and they had to go back through basic. Why that was the case, I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds kind of odd, but okay. So you had a mix of sort of older people and that kind of thing. Now, how long was basic training?
Basic training at that time, they were in a hurry, and it was only about 8 weeks.
Yeah, well, 8
and it
weeks
was less, and so we would train, usually, it was quite a few hours of training per day, including Saturday. In fact, other troops would not do Saturday, or at least half a day Saturday. We'd do full day Saturday, and then get Sunday off. But they were cutting a few corners. They wanted to get people trained on the line as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. All right. And what did the actual training consist of?
You would have a lot of it was so doing things collectively, marching, close order drill, doing your PT, all exactly the same way to make you act like you're in a unit. Rifle training, weapons training. So you had to become proficient, of course, in your rifle, M16. Then you were trained in all the other things, grenades, and you got to use, an M60 and 50 machine gun. We got to use the, I forget what they called, but now it's the anti-tank, very primitive anti-tank weapons, which was a cylinder that you pulled apart to activate, put it on your shoulder. It was like, not a bazooka, but it was very accurate. I fired them and you go, I could hit that tank at 125 yards, and I go, well, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, that was called a LAW, light anti-tank weapon.
Right, and so you see what they have today are very sophisticated, using ones in Ukraine.
Although there is an upgraded version of the LAW.
It really is there.
There's an N-LAW that they're using now. I think, though, that is precision guided. So
this one was
but it's still a single shot tube.
Yeah, right. And you were told, once you shot it, you destroyed it, because the enemy could use it as a mortar. So it was like a one-shot item. So, and then you learned first aid, primitive first aid. You'd be able to save somebody's life just by putting pressure on his wound. And PT, of course, to get you in physical shape. Running everywhere. Wake up and run before you eat.
Right. Now, what did they do in terms of to enforce discipline or instill discipline within the group?
To enforce discipline, like I said, they would be giving an order, and if anybody messed up a simple order, platoon, attention, right face, and somebody turns the wrong way, that the verbal barrage would be really impressive, and strings of adjectives which I could not repeat. I actually saw this occur. I saw a man who was asleep, and the sergeant came from behind him, took his fist and smacked him in the back of the head, knocked him over. He jumped up in reaction, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to do that." And I also saw another sergeant stand up to a little 5'6" sergeant, but it was tough as nails. Put his face right into a 6'3" guy and said, "I want you to hit me." "I'm not going to hit you, drill sergeant. I want you to hit me. I'm not going to hit you back. Hit me." "No, drill sergeant." And we were watching. We were very impressed to not agitate the drill sergeant. And I realized what they were doing. He says you have to be brought down, and you have to act as a unit initially. Do we want you to think? Of course not. We want you to react to orders. So I would say that the discipline was pretty tough, but I understood the reason for it.
So you at least kind of got the logic of it, and so
I did.
you just kind of get along
And right, I just got along. I just said, okay, I'll do what you want me to do. I'm not a smart aleck, but one time we were in formation, and the drill sergeant put us at ease, and I said, "Drill sergeant, I have a question." "Yeah, you blankety blank," he says, drill sergeants seem to be use guttural directions. They say things like, "Here, there, he, or, ha, there, rah, there." I said, "Why don't you just use, the actual vernacular English?" I say it like that. And he actually thinks I'm serious, so he starts to answer the question. In the military tradition, there's always been this way. And I go, okay. Chuckle a little bit.
All right. Now, were there tensions among the men initially when they got there? Because you mentioned you had these different ethnic or regional divisions between them.
I would say that most of the people there, most of them were not draftees. They were volunteered to be there, and they had various reasons. And so they said, they want to be here, and I'm going to get along with you, and you got to get along with me. So I didn't see that. We did have racial cooperative training, because there would be, and when I said there were boys from the hills of Kentucky who had a particular point of view, and the very tough inner city boys from Miami and Detroit, would they meld well? Not particularly. They set in their two sets. But it wasn't like there was, I saw real racial animosity.
Okay. All right. So you survived that first 8 weeks.
Yep.
Now, in the process, do they figure out what they want to do with you? Or?
Oh, right. There's an interview process. And so I was, you go through all the barrier of tests. And they said, okay, you would be qualified over here. I'm a college graduate, so I'm not going to be a rifleman, and I'm not going to be a corpsman, and I'm not going to be a cook or something. So I ended up saying, okay, you can work with computers in communications. And I said, fine. And then they said, where would you like to go? Where would you like to be stationed? And I go, well, is there anything in Michigan? No, nothing in Michigan. Went down the list. And the man actually said, he actually used the phrase, he says, here's what it's called. He said, Carlisle Barracks was what he said, Carlisle Barracks. It's in Pennsylvania. I said, fine. Didn't know what it was. When I came home and told for a leave, I told my father, and he said, no, that's Carlisle Barracks. And he actually said, in World War II, it was the place where they did the basic training for doctors and dentists, and he was stationed there. And so I said, oh, so when he came to see, those buildings were there when I was here. So that was so you go through a process, and there's not only is there a mental examination and a physical examination, there's a psychological examination, and you say, okay, you would be good for this, you would not be good for this. To an extent, what's the left door is where they go, rifle company.
Yeah, well, it's sort of ever that way.
That's correct.
And it was certainly the case in World War II in terms of what was because all the people with the higher aptitudes got siphoned off by everybody else. Yeah, which wasn't always a good thing for the rifle companies.
Correct.
Yeah, but in your case, okay. So when did you report there? Or did you have to do advanced training?
Yes, then I was sent to Fort Gordon, Georgia, to do my advanced training, and they were, my MOS was a 72 Foxtrot, was later changed to a 72 Echo, which was a data communication specialist, meaning you had to be able to use the computer and the computer encryption devices and be trained on those. So they needed a lot of them for some reason. I don't know why, and so the school in Fort Gordon was running double shifts. There was a 7 a.m. to 3 o'clock shift and a 3 o'clock to 11 p.m. and I was put in the late shift. And the initial training was basically, clerk work and how to type on a teletypewriter. But they eventually had to put you into the position where you were trained on the classified equipment, and that was in a big building, which was concrete, one door with an MP at the gate with a pistol. You had to be classified to get in. And they could only siphon so many men at a time into that building, and they had too many. So I was called in with 12 other men. We go to this room. The colonel of the division comes in. We all step to attention. Sit down, men, sit down. I got some interesting news. I said, we're really short on time and space, and so we need to have you men volunteer to go to midnight school from 12 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. And you have to go to learn this in the secure building, which means you cannot use a pencil and paper. Everything is memorized. You cannot bring anything to write in there. We all volunteered, by the way. I guess it wasn't you were assigned was really the case. So we had to go in there, and it was a serious business. Trying to learn things by memory at 3 a.m. is not the best educational option, and I'm a teacher and I know that. I remember one night we were trying to typing. You would be put in a spot where I was the transmitter, and another man in the other part of the building would be a receiver, and we'd be typing on the equipment. And I had to tell him that we were ready to do what's called the changeover. You had to recalibrate the machine, and that was called Hotel Charlie 2, was the code to say that we're ready to change over. And so I was not a very good typist, and I was going to type hotel, and I missed the keys or didn't hit them correctly, and it came out H-E-L. Right, okay, I write L-O, and sent the rest of the transmission, and it said hello. So the other guy gets it, and he writes goodbye. Anyway, the sergeant, the instructor, saw that, and he let us know in no uncertain terms that we were violating national security by typing words that we shouldn't have typed, and okay, won't do that again. But it was an interesting and attempting to learn all those things. I did learn them well, and I scored very high on the exit exam. I knew my job well, but that was an interesting place to try to learn. I tell my students now, don't take a class from midnight to 6:30. I learned to drink a lot of coffee, and I never drank coffee before.
Okay. Well, what was your sort of daily schedule like at that point then?
They told us when they called us in, they said, men, you're going to do this midnight school. We will not bother you the rest of the day. Okay. You do not have to do PT. We will wake you up and tell, dinner's ready, but then walk out of the room. So that group of men had a degree of freedom that other people did not have. Now, I still wouldn't have chosen to do that. You do what the Army tells you to do, and you say, yes, sir.
Now, what were the computers at that point like? Because this is still fairly early.
We had mainframe computers, and so the one I used when I was working, the first one was a IBM 360, and then later was a UNIVAC 9000 series, and they were quite large. And then you had the encryption devices were off to the side, and they were set up. There were 6 of them, so that if you had a breakdown, they would still be able to transmit secure material. And of course, what the encryption device would do would take the computer data, which is English, put it over here, scramble it all up, send it to the Pentagon, whatever the receiver is, and then if the enemy is watching, all they're seeing is junk coming and you go, you don't know where it's always this constant. You don't know where it starts or stops. So they were quite large, and we still use teletypewriters. So you still had paper tape coming out, which was Hollerith code, and for the computer, we used IBM cards. So you would type up a message on an IBM card and run it through.
Okay. And do you have a sense as to what the actual sort of capacity of a computer was relative to a modern cell phone?
It would be
or something?
A handheld calculator would have a greater ability to have memory than those computers. The computers basically would get input and print it out, and you would rip it off, and you had paper copies. We had a very elaborate system of how to take care of the paper copies and elaborate instructions if you were besieged or attacked, how to destroy those things.
All right. So how long did you spend in advanced training?
So in advanced training, that was about 2 or 3 months.
Okay. All right. Now you were down in Georgia. Did you get to go off base at all? Or?
Oh yeah, actually, because I was married, I got permission to get an apartment off base, and there was a few other men. There was about 4 of us that we got in an apartment complex, and we enjoyed each other's company. And so kind of almost, I was doing my training and come home, and I would take off my uniform, and I could almost live as a civilian, except I had no hair, and everybody else in the world, the 70s, had long hair.
All right. But if you're down in Georgia, there probably wasn't maybe as much, say, hostility toward the military as you might have other places?
So if I went knowing, so you'd walk in I had my uniform on and went shopping, there would be no problem. In Carlisle, it was, what's the word I want to use? Not tolerate. They enjoyed the fact that this was a rather prestigious, small little unit. And it was, like I said, it was like a small Ivy League graduate school more than anything else, like not a regular military unit. So there was, there was not especially in the South, not an antagonistic feeling according to the military at the time.
Okay. So when do you then go on to Carlisle?
So I went to Carlisle, must have been, April 1973. And I showed up, and I had not, my top secret security clearance didn't come through for some reason. And I was, my commanding officer, a warrant officer, Mr. Beatles, came in and said, "Hoffman, why don't you have your security clearance?" I don't know. And they were giving me odd jobs, and then finally it came through, and where I had to go to work was, so it was the U.S. Army War College. If you can just picture it, it's this little idealistic community with academic buildings, but then houses for the colonels. And it was a little tiny community, PX, commissary, movie theater, bowling alley, swimming pool, just self-enclosed. Nice place. But there's this one place in the middle which had this barbed wire fence around it, which was where I worked, which was the communications facility and what's called the operations group. And I will admit to you that what was in there was a classified reason of why the War College was there. Anyway, so my first day I went in, and I went into my building, and you walked in, and it was a double door, so they had one-way mirror, and they could see you, okay, let you in. And I knew I was supposed to go to the left, where the work was, and they said, "Hoffman, go to the right, go in this room." Okay. And a civilian came in and said, had a notebook, "Ma'am," he says, "all right, why are you here?" And I explained, "Well, I'm going to be in communications working for the War College." "That's good, that's your story. Now here's why you're here." And he proceeded to tell me, "Everything I tell you is confidential. You cannot speak about this." He said, "If you did, you would be sent to Fort Leavenworth." You understand what I'm telling you? "Yes, sir, I do." Okay. And then, so the classified information was told me, and then I went back to do my job. That was my first day.
All right. So basically, this is operating separately from the actual functioning of the War College?
Right. If you say the War College is a place of training colonels,
Yep.
so they can become generals.
Right.
Okay, it's an academic institution, and these colonels really enjoy it because they have a time off where they don't have the incredible responsibility of being in charge of a division, let's say.
Yeah.
And then they know they're going to be promoted someday, so it's a good place to go. So then we're doing some other things. Obviously, we have to have communication. Why do you have this really sophisticated piece of equipment here was the story, that why we were there.
All right. So were there, so did you get to live off base at that point?
I actually did, because here they had houses for the colonels.
Okay.
And they had an enlisted men barracks for the typical enlisted man. I'm married. I said, "Well, you have to find an apartment off base," which I didn't object to, because then, again, I went home to my wife, and she cooked me dinner, and we would go to the store and go to the church and walk and almost live a civilian life. Now, my landlord, obviously the people around me knew that I was a soldier, but I could enjoy my life. And the Carlisle community was rather small, old. It's an old place. The apartment we had was actually a 200-year-old building that had once been a store, and it was a narrow row house. Yeah. But we enjoyed living there. I made a lot of good friends.
So that was kind of in sort of the old downtownish section of Carlisle?
Well, actually, you're right. We were off a little bit of the downtown area, and so if we wanted to go downtown, we just walk
Yeah.
downtown. So we enjoyed living there.
Yeah. All right. Did you have much contact at all with any of the War College people, either the enlisted or
Yes.
colonels?
Because of the work we had to do, so we were always getting in communication, and of course, in communication we have different classifications. You have security classifications, which are unclassified information. There's unclassified EFTO, which is encrypt for transmission only. You had things that were confidential, secret, and top secret. And then you had, how important was it? You had routine messages, immediate, which meant routine meant you could let it hang around before you deliver it. And the immediate said you should do it pretty quick. Priority meant you should do it right now. And then the last one was flash. Flash was you should have delivered it 10 minutes ago. So that we would always be delivering messages to people and interacting with them, including, I interacted with many high-level officers. When we worked with what's called the operations group, and in the operations group was probably 9 or 10 colonels, and then probably a dozen or so first sergeants or master sergeants. And I was trained in a secondary MOS to run the phone bank in the operations group. The phone bank was really the precursor to internet. Mm-hmm. We had a big bank, and right here you could push a button, and that was Stuttgart, Germany. You push a button, that's Panama City. Push a button, that's Anchorage, Alaska. Immediate connection. And so I was trained to run that. So I'm interacting with these people all the time. And on the night shift, our colonel would say to me, "Hey, Hoffman, you want to play chess?" And I'd say, "Okay, let's play chess." I'm interacting with these officers like nobody, a normally enlisted man would never do that. So I had quite a bit of interaction with the military section of life.
Okay. But these were people basically who were part of the same outfit that
Correct.
you were in, as opposed to the ones who were there as students in the War College.
I met with a few of them. we had to do some work in the War College itself. And they would usually be interested, "What are you doing?" Look over your shoulder. And we had, and one of our jobs was to recalibrate any piece of equipment that was communication, including secure phones. And there was, in the operations group, they had an room, which was, again, reinforced concrete was around it, and the door was a bank safe door, 18 inches thick. And only certain men could go in there. We had to go in there to recalibrate the equipment, but nobody else was allowed. And so we would get in and open the safe. And one time I remember clearly where I'm going in with my buddy to do the work, and I didn't like closing the door and locking us in. That made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't close it all the way. And a colonel of one of the students, colonels, came by, and he had never been in there. And he kind of opened the door and wanted to look in. And I said, "Sir, you are not authorized to be in here." And I'm a moldy enlisted man. And he obeyed me and left. And I go, "Oh," I was impressed.
All right. Now, this is an era where the military had been downsizing a lot from Vietnam. A lot of the people who had advanced during the Vietnam era and moved up are starting to get weeded out and so forth. In different parts of the Army in particular, there were serious morale issues and things.
Yes.
Now, where you were, did any of that stuff filter through?
And I knew that was the case, and I knew that it was, for example, a soldier coming back from Vietnam would try to hide the fact that he was a veteran because he would be spit on in the airport or say, "Why did you kill babies?" And they were I would grow my hair as quickly as possible and burn my uniform. And so I knew that was the case, but again, the War College was just a different atmosphere. Yeah. So these men, even though they had all had served in Vietnam, and all knew what was happening at the time, were at least saying, "Take a breath, I can kind of relax here."
Yeah, I guess if they'd gotten into the War College, then they're still in the system. They haven't become redundant yet and been pushed out. So that they would not be feeling that same kind of tension that you might have.
I would believe that's the case.
In other places. All right. Did any of them ever talk about Vietnam?
one of the lasting memories I have was in the operations group, they had a floor-to-ceiling map of Vietnam. And then during this, after, basically we pulled out in 73 mostly, we still had people there. But as it came down to the end of my time period, about 75, the northern, Vietnamese communist troops were coming down and taking over the provinces one at a time from the top and the bottom. So they would color in red the ones that were captured, and it was going like this. And I would see all these sergeants who were first sergeants or master sergeants, 20 years experience, all had served. Would walk up to that map, put their hands in their pocket, and their head would go like this. And we'd talk about it, and they go, worthless. My buddies died for nothing. And they were all bitter. And I don't know if they talked, we should have done more. I think most of them, all of them said we should not have been there. So their experience was, who put us there? Politicians. And because we were soldiers, we obeyed orders and went. But they felt pretty bad about it.
Now, from where you were, did you have any sense of the Cold War climate at the time? The concerns over what the Soviets might be doing or the Chinese?
I think I can tell these stories. We had we went through an exercise, and the exercise was an attack by Russia in Europe using tactical nuclear weapons. And in the exercise, actually, one of them dropped on Carlisle. And the Russians knew what we were doing. They said we were wiped out, but they said you must stay on as an observer. And that was a night where we were bringing messages by the bucket load, going back and forth. But I went in and I actually saw the map, and they had the map on the wall. And they said, here's where Russia's attacking, and here's where NATO is responding. So they were all the time fighting in Vietnam, but planning for if the Cold War would turn into a hot war.
All right. So what were the basic dates of when you were in Carlisle?
I was in there from mid '73 to '75.
Okay. Now, are there other particular events or experiences or impressions that you have that you haven't kind of brought into the story yet?
Well, one of the little stories I have is on that night where we were doing all sorts of messages, and this is an example of what I view my Army job was as a classic citizen soldier, and then a really running into a spit-shined soldier officer. And so it was nighttime, and I was bringing the messages, and it was wintertime, and I had not zipped up my jacket. And I had just gone over, brought the stuff over. None of the colonels objected to what I looked like. And I was just bringing a message. I came back, and the lieutenant bumped into me. Says, Hoffman, zip up your jacket. What are you doing not wearing your jacket correctly? Yes, sir. Okay. Zip it up. The next morning, for some reason, I was assigned a different task. And I know that I had to wear my Class A uniform, and I was off post, so I had driven up to to our office building, parked the car. It was 20 feet from my car to the door. And I got out of the car, and I had my hat in my hand instead of putting it on. Walked to the door. Who meets me at the door is the lieutenant. Hoffman, why isn't your hat on? You blankety blankety blank. I'm putting you on report. Okay. So then my commanding officer, my chief warrant officer, Mr. Beatles, calls me in his office. Says, Hoffman, you're on report. Yes, sir. Did you do these two things, not zip up your jacket and not wear your hat? He's trying to not laugh. Yes, sir. Lieutenant reported you, right? Yes, sir. Don't worry about it, he's an idiot. I said, yes, sir. So that was just, I was treated with great respect, and I did my job well. And they knew that when they tried to talk me into staying, they knew that I wanted to go get out and be a teacher, and they said, well, I really enjoyed my life here, and they all chuckled. But I said it was, like I talked to you before, I was a U.S. citizen that happened to be chosen to go into the military for a period of time to serve my country. Okay, I did. I'm not going to, make it a career, and I'm going to go out. And now I look back and say, it was valuable. It was a valuable experience. Other than that, it was. My wife enjoyed it. We enjoyed the experience, I think. We liked living in Carlisle. We had friends that were civilians and friends that were in the military.
Okay. Now, while you were or the units you were with, they were always all male?
We actually, right at the end, we got orders for a new member of our group, and it said on the list, Sergeant Bertha Rodriguez. Oh, we're going to get a whack, because we used to call them whacks. And she came in, and I will admit to you, sorry to say, that when we saw the name Bertha, we had kind of a picture in our mind. And when this young woman showed up, and she was a slim, attractive Hispanic young lady, and knew her job well, and we liked it that we had. And so she immediately, because she outranked me, she was on my shift, and she said, well, you're the experience. You're now the highest ranking person, so you're in charge. She says, no, I'm not. It says, you know more than I do. Tell me what to do. I said, okay. So she acted correctly, even though she outranked me, knowing that I knew my job, that I could instruct her. But it was a good change of pace.
Were there people who were hostile to the idea of having women in there?
I did not feel that.
Because you were in kind of a peculiar situation. I mean, there might have been less macho posturing most of the time.
Probably. I would, if it had been probably a combat unit, I'm sure that there would have been a difference if all of a sudden I have a platoon of men and and I don't know if they would do this, a sergeant is going to be a female, they would say, what are you thinking of?
Yep.
But ours was, okay, we need to, you act like a professional, you have to know your job and do your job. And if you can do that, we don't care where you're from, what gender you are, what ethnic group you're within. We had a very, very good African-American sergeant that we had. Our white group of men went to the officer and said, we think that Sergeant Hayes should be sent to OCS. He's that good of a man. We had another one and I had all variety. We had one sergeant that was a total jerk. And if I told my wife what name, she'd just laugh at, yeah, that sergeant, yeah, he was a jerk.
All right, so you get some of those. Okay, so but what did they offer you anything when they were trying to get you to?
Yeah, when I did my final interview, because I was supposed to be promoted to sergeant, and I went through a process of interviews, and the board is asking you all sorts of questions, and I answered all my job perfectly. I knew the military, protocols. My uniform looked good, but I knew that I was going to get out in a few months, and I wanted to stay. And I said, well, Hoffman, really, why don't you stay? And I said, well, actually, I want to be a teacher. I want to become a teacher. Oh, you could be a teacher in the Army. You actually have credentials. You're a math teacher. You could be teaching at what's called the West Point Prep School. And you could apply for that and get into that. And I'd start saying, yeah, that sounds really good. Maybe I should try that, thinking, no, I'm not going to. And they really, the three-man board was trying to talk me into it and show, the advantage, you get a bonus, And, I know that one of them was this, where else can you get 30 days paid vacation right off the first day of the job? And I go, let's say I'm going to be a teacher. There's 180 days off. Okay. I go, okay, I guess you win that one. So I like I said, I was willing to serve my time, but I didn't want to be a soldier. I wanted to go back and be a teacher. And I will just say that, so between the time when I'm getting out of the service, I'm now 24 years old. With 3 years of military experience, that actually made me a better teacher.
Well, you would have been more grown up at least.
I was obviously, my father told me later, he said, well, you matured in that time period a lot. I guess the Army was good for you. I said, part of it was just growing up. I think the military experience was of a benefit.
All right. So now you get out. Did you get a teaching job right away, or what did you do?
Well, that's part of my story of getting out. What happened was, I am going to be released from service in October of 75. School started September 1 of 75.
Yeah.
So I'm applying to jobs and all over the country. And actually not back to Grand Rapids. And finally somebody said, well, there's this new school. And they called the school, it's called Grand Rapids Baptist High School at the time, sent me an application. So I sent in 50 others. I sent that one in. And then they called me up. Said, let's do an interview on the phone. I said, okay. And they talked to me. And then they said, at the end of the interview, they said, okay, we'll see you in September. And they hung up. And I'm holding the phone like this. And I said to my wife, I think I just got a job. Anyway, I have to call them back and say, look, I can't get out until October. What are we going to do? And they said, well, what can you do to get out? I said, I don't know. So I didn't know what to do. But I was, at one point, I said, I got a note in my box at work and said, Hoffman, go to see this captain at the U.S. Army War College on next Tuesday at 1400. Okay. I don't know why, so I walk in the room and I said, Captain so-and-so, this is Specialist Hoffman reporting now. Hoffman, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going on here. It's in the summertime, so we're having a big conference here. We're having military people, congressmen, diplomats, ambassadors coming from all over the world are coming to this conference. They fly into the Harrisburg airport, and we have buses to pick them up and bring them to the War College. Except somebody might miss a flight or have a wrong flight or some problem. So we need to have a limousine there, a Lincoln Continental, to be able to pick up people. I'm listening. He said, and we're going to send an officer there and a personnel sergeant. We need a driver. You're the driver. And you just say, yes, sir. Okay. So my job was to wait there for somebody who made an error on their flight, and I had the one that I was able to bring back. It was fun because I got to drive him back and we talked the whole way. He was a educator, a professor from somewhere. Anyway, so during the whole time I'm waiting, I'm sitting next to this personnel sergeant. He says, Hoffman, what are you going to do? Well, I'm getting out, but I need to get out about 6 weeks early. Or 8 weeks early, it was 8 weeks. He says, how much leave time do you have accumulated? 6. Let's see, we could apply for leave, and then we could say, let's just say we give you 2 weeks unpaid leave. We'll see if that works. Okay. So he did out the paperwork, and I said, you got to get people's permission, you know. So you got to go to your commanding officer, my warrant officer, and say, sir, here's my dilemma, here's my solution, what do you think? And he goes, well, if the major okays it, I'll okay it. Okay. No, I make an appointment with the major, Major Adams. And Major Adams was he was a good man. He was an electrical engineer. He knew I was a math guy, so we had nice interaction. I forgot to salute him when I went in. He said, Hoffman, you're supposed to do this. Oh, yes, sir, sorry. So I told him the problem. He says, okay. Well, if personnel okays it, I'll okay it. Okay. So I went down to personnel and said, well, these they would say okay. If you say okay, is that okay? And I went around in a circle and I said, okay. So personnel signed it. The warrant officer signed it. Commanding officer signed it. And I said, brought it back to personnel. And the guy goes, okay, well, we've never done this before. I don't think we'll ever do it again, but here you go. Mm-hmm. So they let me out and just said, when you get home, after 8 weeks, call us back and sign out and tell us you're still alive. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually teaching for 2 months. I'm an active service, regular Army soldier, but teaching in a civilian school, and was able to get out. So I really appreciate that. Worked out really well for me, and I appreciate all the personnel thinking, okay, because during Vietnam they used to have an early out system that if you had a seasonal job, you could get out. Post Vietnam, that went away, so I didn't have that opportunity, but it did work.
All right. Now you start out as a high school teacher. Yep. Okay, and then did you go on and get advanced degrees, or what? I got
my master's degree with a GI Bill. That worked good. In those days, they would pay the tuition and give you there was a small stipend along with it, so I was able to, I was working but go to get my degree, which was very, very helpful. So I taught for 37 years in high school, and then I started to teach as an adjunct professor. Started in, the first one I ever taught was 81, and I taught Part of my story is in 1988, I went and took my family of 5 children and my wife, and I became a headmaster of a school in West Africa, Liberia, West Africa. And that had to do with missionary work, and it's a story of how I got involved in that, because that's like that's a ridiculous thing to do at my age. And we lived in Africa, and then Civil War occurred there, and we had to be evacuated out, thinking we were going to go back in 2 months. Never stabilized, never went back. The friends who finally left in a very dangerous situation, they told me, they said, Bob, as we left, there was a firefight at your school. So I was thinking my school was destroyed, and it was a beautiful little school. And it was not, and actually we were able to use it for other purposes later. But so when I came back from Africa, I actually started to teach adjunct at community college here. And so I've taught there for, 30 years. And then after I got out of high school teaching, I went to do adjunct work at Cornerstone University, and they had some problems with their math department a little bit, and they said, would you consider teaching for a year? I said, full time? I said, sure, I'll be a professor. And then after that, they just continually send me contracts. And so I'm supposed to be retired, but I really enjoy teaching. I love teaching, I love my job, and these people pay me, I can't believe it.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good deal. So the time in Liberia, did you go back to teaching high school again when you got back?
Right, so when I went to Africa, we thought we were just cutting all ties. And I was a headmaster there. I actually had my degree. I could actually be a principal, so I was a headmaster in Africa. And I taught full-time and was a headmaster. It was a small school, international students, really great opportunity. And when I came back, so the first year I came back, there was no high school position. So I began to teach at both Cornerstone and at community college. And then the high school then created a position and called me back. So I had basically two, I was there for a while, away from a while, and then taught there again for a while.
Yeah, so you had a sort of sabbatical.
Correct. Yeah, kind of. Very exciting one. It was when we watched the Ukraine pictures and of the people leaving and evacuating and how hard it was to get out. It was because when we had a big meeting, said, okay, we think we're going to have to evacuate. How many weeks do you need to get your school in order? And I said, I need 3 weeks. If I had 3 weeks, this is like May 1st of 1990. And then they came back a few days later, Bob, you got 1 week. Okay, we'll have graduation, we'll do exams, and I had a party for the seniors. It was really, we did it. I go, okay. And now we said, do you want to leave now? I said, no, I got to get my school in order. I got to kind of make sure it's all locked up and everything, so I need another couple of days. I said, okay. And they said, and I had 5 children, they said, we can't get you out. We can get 4 tickets, we can't get 7. So I told my wife, okay, you take the 3 youngest daughters and I'll take the 2 older kids and we'll stay. And she says, no, we're all going together or we're all staying together. So then we stayed, it was about, and the rebellion was getting closer and closer to the airport to cut off the line so you can't even get to the airport. So it was scary. And finally they said one night, we think we can get out. And there was 3 families, we went at night, and we thought we were going to cross battle lines, and we made it all the way to the airport. And they actually said, I have 4 tickets, I need 3. They said, oh, I think we can do this. And we got out. But we were thinking 2 months later we're going to go back, and it didn't stabilize. So part of our mind, psyche, heart was still there.
Yeah.
The mission we worked for wanted us to go to South America. We actually went to look at it in Ecuador, Quito, Ecuador, and we go, this is really nice, not like Africa. And they realized that we never really left totally, because we've never gone back and said, okay, goodbye. Right?
Yeah. All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a pretty interesting story and an unusual one.
It is, like I said, when I thought about it, the military experience is part of the whole universal experience, and where did we fit? And I started to think about it. I started, like I said, thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whereas now that we've done this, you'll keep remembering stuff. Oh, I could have talked about that.
Probably.
All right, but for the time being, thank you very much for coming in
I
today.
appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
All right.